Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the current early access build of Day of Infamy. This is the second game from New World Interactive. They're the guys who brought us the game Insurgency, which was basically if you took Red Orchestra and transplanted it into a modern setting. Which meant that when Day of Infamy was announced, it was a bit of a head scratcher. I was just sitting there like, wait a minute, isn't this basically just Red Orchestra, but not Red Orchestra? And that's kinda sorta true. It's not quite the same as Red Orchestra 2, for example, but it is very similar. And I'll explain more of that in a moment. Now, some things to keep in mind. First off, full disclaimer, I did receive a review copy of this to take a look at. Second, yes, it's in early access, and it's in a fairly early access build, so keep in mind, you will see bugs and glitches, and it is blatantly unfinished. The public release of the early access build was July 28th of this year, and the most recent update as I'm recording this video was the patch that dropped on August 5th. There's quite a long road ahead. There's lots of fixes that need to be applied, some features that need to be implemented, so it is definitely nowhere near finished, and if you do decide to pick it up in its current state, you do so knowing full well that it's going to be a while before the full experience is actually out. Now with that in mind, let's go ahead and actually take a look at the game proper. Now as far as presentation goes, it does run on the Source engine, and it's basically the same version that Insurgency runs on, and it looks very similar both in art style and in visual quality. This means that it's really not the best looking game out there, although it does have some fairly nice effects here and there, and generally speaking the modeling and animations are rather well done. It's just that the texture quality isn't exactly the highest. In fact, I wouldn't say it's particularly high at all. And while the environments are rather well detailed, unfortunately they're basically just no different from any other World War II shooter out there. Now, of course, the simple fact of the matter is that right now there really aren't all that many maps in the game, so it's really not that surprising that they feel very samey, but it does present a problem when you're running through levels and it looks barely any different from the likes of, say, Day of Defeat especially, or even Call of Duty games from the earlier years. And it really doesn't help that despite really not looking all that great, they haven't implemented all of the optimizations yet, so there are actually performance issues you'll run into. Sometimes the frame rate dips down below 40 FPS, and I really can't figure out why. Because there never really seems to be much rhyme or reason to it. If there were a lot of particle effects on screen, or if there were a lot of physics objects interacting with things, it would make a lot more sense, but sometimes the frame rate will just drop all of a sudden out of nowhere with nothing really happening. So it's pretty inconsistent, and they definitely need to fix that. As of course not to say that the game is unplayable or anything, it's still definitely playable, it's just those frame rate drops can definitely get in your way, and they really need to sort them out. Moving on from there, the interface is very clean, rather minimalistic, and very easy to use, so they did a good job with that. But when you get to the sound design, that's where things start to fall a bit apart. What music is there is pretty generic World War II game fare, and the sound effects themselves really aren't all that great. Most of the weapons just don't sound beefy enough, and a lot of them sound very similar to one another, so it's actually a bit difficult to tell them apart. Which of course makes sense from a tactical standpoint, because you wouldn't really want your weapon fire sounds to identify what you're using in a given situation, but at the same time, it does mean that they all sound rather samey when you're just shooting stuff. And then of course there's the voice acting, which is actually generally rather well done. It's pretty much nothing but battle chatter, but the battle chatter that is there is very well done, it's very believable, and it goes a long way to creating a rather intense atmosphere for the game. I mean, it's the little things like your character kind of freaking out when they're having to reload right after a firefight or right in the middle of a firefight, and they're just throwing expletives all over the place because they're having to deal with this. That sort of thing is definitely going a long way to make the game a lot more believable. But of course, we don't know how the presentation is going to change later on down the line, so for all we know, the sound effects could receive a complete overhaul and the voice chatter could get wildly different by the time the game actually launches full on. We'll just have to see how that sort of thing plays out, but what's really going to make or break this thing for you is the gameplay itself, because the story in this is, it's World War II. You're either playing as the Axis or the Allies, and that's it. Now when you go into the actual gameplay, there are basically three modes: single player, co-op, and versus multiplayer. Now, single player is basically just co-op missions, only you're playing them by yourself, so I'm going to lump those two together. The idea there is that you complete various objectives and you have a bunch of AI-controlled enemies that are going to get in your way constantly. Now, if you're playing single player, then you get a team of AI-controlled squad mates that basically run around like headless chickens and constantly get in the way as well, so that becomes rather problematic. So you're ultimately going to go with the co-op mode where your players hopefully know what they're doing. And you'll be doing things like destroying objectives or capturing objectives, much the same as you would if you were playing, for example, Insurgency. Same thing goes for the actual versus multiplayer. You complete various objectives, usually capturing various points scattered throughout the map, and you have reinforcement waves that you need to worry about because the reinforcement waves actually dictate how many times you can spawn in. If your team's out of reinforcement waves, then they can't actually respawn, so what's going to happen is your team is going to have to capture a point or just straight up eliminate the enemy team if it's come down to that. And by doing so, they will be able to either win the particular round for you, or they will be able to get more reinforcement waves to deal with. Now, of course, there is a problem with this mechanic. In its current state, it is ludicrously unbalanced. One team always has an advantage on a given map, particularly if you're playing, for example, Dog Red, which is the pretty much Omaha beach landing. So what ends up happening there is the Germans already control all 3 points, and they get 3 times the number of respawn waves that the Allies do. It is blatantly unfair. Understandable, of course, given the situation, but at the same time, it does become very, very irritating if you are playing on the Allies and your team is not working together in order to complete the objectives. It means your team is going to get constantly just mowed down by machine gun and rifle fire, and ultimately, you're going to become very, very irritated. So they definitely need to balance that sort of thing out a bit more, and the sides themselves could use a bit more balancing in general. I mean, to give you a prime example, whenever the British faction shows up in the faction rotation, a lot of people start complaining about it because their weapons aren't really quite on par with the Germans, for example. Now, I'm pretty sure that's by design, but they could definitely stand to do a bit more balance tweaking with that, just to make sure everything's not too wildly one-sided there. Now, of course, that does bring me to the loadout system in general, which is done in the same manner that Insurgency did it. You have a series of classes that dictate what weapons and equipment are available to you, and you are given an allotment of supply points that you can use to get various bits of equipment and various attachments for your equipment. So, for example, you can get speed loaders for the Webley revolver, or you can get stripper clips for any of the bolt-action rifles, and those definitely improve things pretty considerably. And you really do have to pay attention to your loadout, because whatever you've got, you're stuck with it until you respawn, and that can take quite a while. And because of the way the respawns are set up, you can't just go running and gunning all the time. You can do it when it's really safe to do so, but that's really not all that often. Really, the game works best when you're being very slow and methodical and working as a team, because then you can actually compensate for each other's shortcomings. All of which are much more apparent in Day of Infamy because it is set in World War II, and that means that you have a bigger disparity between the various classes. In Insurgency, for example, a rifleman would be using an M16 or an AK, and those are just as good in close quarters as they are at long range. They're usually better at medium range, but still. And yet, in Day of Infamy, all of the riflemen are basically using either bolt-action or semi-automatic rifles, and those are pretty much worthless in close combat. So it helps to have a guy there with a shotgun or a submachine gun or even an LMG that can help back you up on that. And that's where the teamwork really comes into play, and unfortunately, we don't really have a heck of a lot of that right now. Don't get me wrong, there is teamwork, particularly with regards to the officer class, because the officer can call in artillery strikes as long as there is a radio nearby, and you can actually select the radio as part of your kit. So it behooves you to get together with your team and discuss what your loadouts are going to be so you know exactly what's going to go on with that. But because of that radio requirement, an officer definitely needs to work together with their team because they aren't really as self-sufficient as the other classes. For example, if you're playing as a rifleman or an assault class, then your roles are pretty straightforward. You run and you throw grenades at things, you clear out rooms, that sort of thing. And if you're a rifleman, you tend to pick things off at longer ranges. But then there are the more specialized roles, like the sniper or the support class, and those are really things that will work way better if you are working well with your team. And again, we don't really have a lot of that right now because it is in early access and the player base is pretty small right now. That's something that will definitely improve once more people get playing this and more people really get into it once it actually fully releases. But for the time being, really all that's there in Day of Infamy is the basis that the previous game that New World Interactive did had to go on. It's just a lot more rough this time around. The movement system and the weapon handling are almost identical to the way they were in Insurgency, the difference being that you're dealing with World War II technology, so pretty much means that the Germans are kind of overpowered right now. Gotta love those STG-44s, but that's really beside the point. The foundation is definitely there. It has the core gameplay mostly down. It's down to just some fairly simple tweaking that needs to be done to really iron it out and make it really, really solid. But it's definitely got that same core that Insurgency did, where it's a slow, methodical, tactical game where you have to work really well as a team in order to achieve the best success. The map design, while admittedly a bit weaker in the aesthetic department, is definitely pretty strong in the actual gameplay design standpoints, and there's enough variety in the game modes to definitely keep you interested. They definitely need to fix the AI because it's pretty much brain dead, meaning that the single player experience in particular is almost worthless in its current state, and the co-op experience is severely hampered by it. And of course there's all the weird bugs and glitches they need to iron out and the performance issues that they definitely need to improve. But in its current state, it's definitely headed in the right direction. They're definitely patching it pretty regularly and taking our feedback into account, so it's definitely improving as time goes on. It's just that it might take it a bit to get there, and we'll just have to wait and see how that goes ultimately. And of course my big problem with it is that it's pretty much just Red Orchestra, only without the Russians, and it's really not as good. Of course, to be fair here, Red Orchestra 2 was kind of a disaster on launch and got a lot better over time, and Red Orchestra 1 is still pretty fantastic to this day. But those are both finished games, whereas this one is in early access and it's undergoing constant changes. So who knows, it may turn out a lot better in the long run. I will definitely do a full review of this once the full version is out, but until then, know that at least as far as August 10th goes, it's definitely going in the right direction, and it has a pretty solid base built up already. They just need to refine that a lot more and implement all the features they were wanting to implement. So we'll ultimately see where that goes in the long run, but for the time being, they actually have a pretty solid base here, and if you're willing to overlook the very, very rough edges, then you might actually be able to get some enjoyment out of this. It may be nowhere near full release quality, but at least it's in a state where it can actually be enjoyable. Thanks for watching.